Howdy, and welcome to EDCI 605, Qualitative Research and Education. I'm so excited that you're taking this course with me. In this module, I would like to review some of the basics about qualitative research, what it is, how is it different from quantitative research, what are some of the philosophical underpinnings of it, what are some of its characteristics, what situations is it meant for, and what situations is it not recommended for. And then briefly, I will also review the article that I've assigned, which is a basic qualitative study on family home visits, and kind of point out not only the highlights of the article, but also what I hope that you will focus on from a methodological perspective, because that is, of course, what we are here to discuss today, which is the methodological underpinnings of many of these research studies that you have been reading all along. So I'll share my screen, try to keep it brief. Go. So introduction to qualitative research. So what is it? What are we talking about? You've already by this point, I'm sure many times heard the term qualitative research. And of course, currently you've probably heard the term research a lot, because it's certainly used a lot more loosely than it ever has been. I mean, we even talk about, I wouldn't go to the mall without doing my research, like as to what's available. And that's, of course, not the sense in which we're using research in this course, or the kind of research that you are trying to do. That kind of research is more gathering information, but of course, research as you do it within the academy and for professional purposes is a systematic and loosely, we would say, scientific investigation of something. So there are actual methods to be used, and there are safeguards, there are considerations of ethics, human subjects. There are all kinds of things that go into the formal kind of research. Of course, there are two main kinds, basic research, which is sort of trying to understand something that probably has not, some kind of phenomena that's not fully understood. There's no specific context in which it is trying to be applied. So like something on, every day we read about different phenomena that we don't, like heart disease in women, for example. There's so much about that we don't know because that has not been emphasized. So exploratory kinds of studies, in a sense, you could think of them as basic, but many forms of research could even start out as basic, but many end up being applied research because there is a specific context in which the findings are applied. So many of the kinds of studies that you do for your records of study have a very specific context in which they are going to be applied. And of course, within basic and applied research, there are all kinds of different ones. One of my favorites that's certainly not emphasized enough is what's called appreciative inquiry, which is the, trying to highlight something that's positive. There are evaluation studies, which typically are more focused on trying to highlight some of the things that could be done better, but appreciative inquiry is much more focused on highlighting positive sorts of positive aspects of a particular situation. Qualitative research is often, and I'm not a fan of putting things into binaries all the time, but many times you will find qualitative research often defined as almost the opposite of quantitative research. And in some ways, some of the assumptions of each are quite diametrically opposed to one another. So quantitative research is typically, it's either experimental or quasi-experimental, where you're trying to determine the cause of events. So let's kind of use that heart disease as that example that we already touched on. So what could be the cause of heart disease? Is it high cholesterol, as we've been led to believe for a long time, although now I hear that there's some question about that? Is it lack of exercise? Is it too much sugar? So trying to establish causes, like direct causes of events, and to predict similar events in the future. Like some of these experimental approaches have shown us that heart attacks, the likelihood of a second heart attack is much higher if you've had one. But that also kind of fits into the quasi-experimental approach, because if the random, like a random sample where you are trying to determine if, cause and effect, because you're not, selecting the population specifically, but from the general population, you take a random sample. And if you can establish something that works in them, it's likely to be true for everyone else. But then again, think about, you can't have a random sample of someone who's already had a first heart attack. So that feeds more into that quasi-experimental approach. So that's one kind, the kind of research that tries to establish cause and effect. And these are, of course, as you can imagine, typically, you apply statistical techniques. So you pull a random sample from a certain population, and what number also depends on how big the population would be. And then you run these statistics to see what shows up as more likely or predictive. But there's another form of experimental or quantitative research that is more descriptive. Again, it uses a lot of descriptive statistics to systematically describe facts and characteristics of a given phenomena. And again, think how powerful numbers are in this. And it's like, just if we take, again, staying with heart disease in women, like just knowing the numbers, how many of these heart attacks are fatal, how many are mild, how many are moderate, and what are the relationships? So are, are there connections to like various lifestyle sorts of things? So this isn't trying to predict anything, but just giving us lots and lots of numerical description is also very helpful. And I do want to say that including numerical descriptive data is very much something that you can do as part of qualitative research studies, because qualitative studies are not anti-number. What they're trying to, they are not designed to try and predict causes and effects or to predict what might happen in the future. They are much more descriptive. And so even if you are doing quantitative research, but you limit yourself to description, there's a lot more similarity between those designs and qualitative designs. But in essence, qualitative researchers are interested in understanding how people interpret their experience. As you'll see in the experimental approaches, there wasn't anything on what does a heart attack feel like how did the patient describe it or something like that. So let's take a different example. So it isn't just that, small schools tend to work better than large schools. We can collect lots of data on that, and we might be able to predict that a smaller graduating class might have a higher GPA, something like that. So you can do that kind of experimental approach, but you can't, in that, you cannot say how, what is it about a small school that makes it better? What is it more intimate? Do the kids make more friends? What kinds of friendships do they have? Do the teachers tend to plan together more? How do they interpret their experiences? What is the teacher-student relationship like in a classroom if it's a smaller school? How do they construct their worlds? So what is the principal like? What kind of philosophy do they lay out for the school? Maybe that translates better in a small school. And the meanings that they attribute to their experience, how kids even understand education. These are all questions that qualitative researchers answer and try to investigate. So that's really the meaning, how people interpret something. A lot of that is what qualitative researchers do. It comes as a discipline from anthropology. So, those you might have read of the early anthropological studies, people like Margaret Mead, who went all the way to Samoa to describe, among other things, the, social customs among, various cultures around the world. And so that their whole purpose was to describe a culture and to try to understand it from the inside out. That's why anthropologists spent so much time in the cultures that they studied, because they wanted to be there for long enough to fully understand what was happening. And the originally qualitative researchers went away to do research, but as the method and the chapter describes that, as it grew more popular and it came back home, what it does, it also it tries to make the familiar strange. So we all think we understand what school is like, but when you take a deep dive into a classroom and you really try to explain all the little things that happen, like what are the routines? Why do the kids why are they only allowed to sharpen their pencils twice a day? Or why do they have to line up a certain way? Or why do they have to hang their backpacks, where? So these are all familiar actions to all of us, but in this in-depth description, we're making it kind of something like we feel like, oh, well, I didn't really know that about it. And that's something that qualitative research is really good at. Inductive analysis is key to qualitative research in that you're not trying to, test a hypothesis, but rather you generate your findings from the study. So it's not like you have a hypothesis and you come to test it, but you gather the data and maybe at the end you have a hypothesis of this is probably how things work here. And it's mostly conducted in naturalistic settings, which is in the setting in which they would occur, whether you were doing research or not, which is as compared to, a lot of research in science, which is done in laboratory settings. The philosophical perspective, and I know you've probably heard some of these terms already, but key to an understanding of why we do, why is it that we're trying to understand what meanings kids attach to school? That goes back to what is the nature of reality and to some extent also the nature of knowledge. So if we say, well, school is, it's a place for kids to get educated, it is meant to, these are the functions that it is meant to perform. That's one, if that's what we say it is, then you are probably adopting like a positivist view of the world that says there is a reality that exists. And our job as researchers is to find it and explain it. Whereas from the qualitative perspectives, we are much more likely to focus on an interpretive orientation to the world, a critical orientation to the world, or maybe a postmodern orientation to the world. Interpretive orientations to the world says that reality is socially constructed. So there is school is not the same thing for everyone. It is going to be what we construct it to be. And as we know, for some kids who, their kids, popularity has been ranked on various dimensions, and the popular kids have a very different view of what of what school is like as compared to maybe what's called the neglected kids, the kids that nobody seems to notice. And maybe for them, school is a pretty scary place. And what about the kids who are, they're sort of the kids who are everyone is a little afraid of, but they also like them. They have a different view of what school is. So it's all about how how we interpret reality. So how each kind of child interprets reality is their reality. And that's what we are trying to study when we do qualitative research. Now, critical research goes beyond interpretation. So just taking that example to where we say that there are popular kids and there are neglected kids, and then there are kids who are disliked, and then there's some who are somewhat liked, somewhat disliked, but they're also they can get in trouble more often. But critical research would try to understand why is that happening, and is it more likely that the popular kids, do they tend to be from higher socioeconomic backgrounds? Do they tend to be is that so they're trying to study it from what are these larger societal factors that influence these different realities that are constructed. So they don't just like, if perhaps they, like there's some well-known ethnographies of urban schools that don't just document what happens, but they also try to talk about why that might happen and why these urban schools, they don't have a big funding base, and that's why funding is restricted, and that's why they have outdated textbooks. So it's not just the description of how kids might struggle in the classroom with limited resources, but what are some of the causes for that? So especially focusing on power relationships. And then postmodern perspectives say that, modernism is sort of the scientific narrative that modernism is, it's all about, we've discounted anything that's illogical or, doesn't fit the sort of reason and, logical thinking, that there's like grand narratives of like progress or what education is. There's certainly a grand narrative that education is the way towards a better future. And postmodernism would say, well, let's not quickly jump into that. Let's think about how these things have been constructed, because these are ultimately social constructions. So to define it, qualitative research is an activity that puts the observer in the world. So it's done in natural settings. The setting would exist whether or not the researcher was there. But what qualitative researchers do is they try to make that world visible, because we're all in the world, but we're not necessarily doing research on it. So you might be, a third grade teacher, and your world is, teaching your lessons, getting the kids to lunch on time. But the researcher is the one who's observing and, documenting how the kids make meaning of something. What are the material practices? What lessons are, not just what lessons are taught, but what materials are used, what objects are used. So qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings, trying to make sense of or interpret the phenomena in terms of how people make sense of them. So let's say we read, as many high school students do, Jane Austen is one of the texts that they have to read. And I remember my son just absolutely hating it. He's saying, this makes no sense to me. And when you think of it, a 16-year-old boy, and he's reading about 18th century England, and it's mostly from the perspective of women, and it's focused on a world that's very different, a set of customs that are very different. So that, you're trying to make sense of why would someone not relate to that book. So it isn't just the book, but the relationship between the reader and the book. So then how does a 16-year-old boy make sense of the world? What are some of the ideas that they have? What's some of the language that they use? What are some of the objects that they're more interested in? For example, he was really interested in World War II, and I'm sure if the book had been about something similar to that, it would have been something. So it wasn't necessarily that it was an older book, but that it wasn't about something that interested him. So it's really about understanding how people make meaning. So meaning is, and we're trying to understand it not from the outside perspective, but from the insider's perspective. So you're trying to almost walk in the shoes of that person and try to see how they make sense of the world. So it's like if like it's the high school student walking down the hallway, and you're almost like walking behind them, trying to see like what kind of, how do they talk to their friends? And I mean, it's not something I'd want to do. Just thinking back to teenagers and, some of the things that they say to each other, because they definitely could be very mean. But it's almost like, okay, so somebody, making this mean joke to you, but you don't take it personally, but you kind of retort with something back. So, kind of understanding that sort of discourse from the insider's perspective. So what is it like to even have that mindset? So you've probably been thinking about this already. If we're trying to understand how people make meaning, then the only way that we could do that is through another human being, because the only I don't know about AI, but really as of now, the only instrument that's possible to use that can understand how human beings make meaning is another human being, because human instrument has to be responsive, adaptive, but also kind of has the same capabilities as other human beings. Of course, no two human beings are the same, and so we absolutely have to reflect on our own subjectivity. So if I'm studying, for example, the interaction between teenage boys in high school, I have to remember what was my experience when if I was a male, for example, was I a teenage boy? What was my time like? And did I feel like I was bullied all the time? So maybe then I'm interpreting their experience through my lens. So how can I keep myself honest? So that's why in the reliability and validity pieces for qualitative research, there's a lot of disclosing subjectivity, but dialoguing with it, examining it, and trying to see how can I can't ever see anything from anyone's perspective except my own, but how can I also try to almost bracket that and document somebody else's? As already mentioned, there's much more emphasis on inductive analysis, that is finding meaning from the data, not using the data to confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis that you already have. And the big emphasis on rich descriptions. That is one of the questions that's often asked, like if you're only studying one situation, how can this apply anywhere else? And the key answer here is that qualitative researchers don't generalize for you. They don't say, since I studied this third grade classroom, this can apply to all third grade classrooms, but they describe the third grade classroom with rich, also called thick descriptions in such a way that reading it, you might say, oh, this is something that can apply to my classroom. So the importance of those rich descriptions, like you don't, and this is something that I often comment on in your case studies, is that I want you to, describe it. Like if you're studying, whatever it is, the experience of, taking summer school, then, describe the school. What is the approach like? Where do you park? Do you have to wear an ID around your neck? Do you have to check in every morning? Does your ID have its picture on it? Do you take classes with the same kids that you've had class with all year? Who are those other kids? What size are the groups? How big are the classes? What's the classroom like? What's on the walls? What language is the teacher speaking? Is there a schedule posted? How long is the day? All this description gives you a sense of what's happening here and gives you enough information to say, okay, this might apply to my context as well. So the key characteristics of qualitative research is often that the design is emergent, as we're talking about documenting human behavior in social situations. Things can happen, and you kind of have to follow the data where it takes you. So you might go into a study saying that I want to understand why are so many new teachers leaving the field, let's say alternatively certified teachers leaving this particular school. But then I enter the school and I'll say I want to follow these three teachers who are all new and they're all alternatively certified. But after maybe 3 rounds of observation, I find that it's not that they're alternatively certified, but that they had very different professions. And it seems to me that they are not, it's not just the nature of the certification, but what profession they had before they entered teaching that seems to be a bigger predictor. So maybe when I interview these teachers, I'm not just going to focus on what are you struggling with in the classroom, but I'm going to focus on what did you do before? And like if you, for example, as many do, did you serve in the military? Are you accustomed to much more structured situations? And is that something that is, maybe not helping you as much? with adapting to teaching. This is just an example that I made up, but it is that key thing is that that the design is emergent. I always tell my students that when you lay out your study in the beginning of a qualitative study, and at the end, if you have done exactly what you plan to do, then I get a little concerned, because that means that maybe you didn't follow the data as interesting a place as it could go, because we don't ever really know what's in a situation until we've investigated it in depth. Typically, qualitative research, as you can imagine, we're talking about rich, thick description, lots of time spent in the field. So we generally have small samples, and as opposed to random samples where out of 1,000 people, we're going to randomly pick 25. Here, you're very strategic about who you pick. So if you want to, again, follow the experiences of all first-year alternatively certified teachers, you have that's a purposeful sample. You cannot randomly sample here. You have to find those individuals specifically. And later on in the course, we'll get into what kind of sampling that is. There has to be a tolerance for ambiguity. Like, there's not going to be like very tightly defined variables as there are in quantitative studies. You don't know what you're going to find, and you have to be uncomfortable, okay being uncomfortable with not knowing this. Our two big methods of collecting data are either you're observing something, like watching what's happening, or you're asking someone what's happening. And so being comfortable with both of those techniques is a big part of the course. And those are two of the methods that we are going to spend time on. And there is a distinction made between qualitative and quantitative research to say that qualitative is all about words, quantitative is all about numbers. As I've already said, you can definitely use numbers in qualitative research, but certainly we are interested in capturing people's language, but also the way that we present the findings of a qualitative study is typically through a written product of some kind. So it's not a statistical table, but it is more a description. And so it's important to develop that comfort with writing. So those are some of the major characteristics of qualitative research. And of course, we'll talk about each and every one of those pieces in much more detail in the class. Finally, to talk a little bit about the article that I've assigned for this module on the construction of home visits. Typically, as you all know, and if any of you have an early childhood background, as I do, we were often taught that home visits were an important part of teaching, because to understand the child, which is what early childhood educators do, you have to get a sense of how things happen in the home. But this article focuses on, this is a different kind of home visit. It's not where you're trying to teach the family, like methods that will support their child in school. But this is a kind of home visit that is, you're trying to learn, like they said, those funds of knowledge. You're trying to learn what is happening in the home so that you can better understand the child. Interestingly, theoretically, they also kind of talked about, this was a great example too of that emergent design. They had wanted to really document the positive aspects of the home and how and why the child was behaving a certain way. But what they found was that what the family wanted more from these home visits was for the teachers to kind of explain to the students, like how to succeed in school, or the codes of power. Like, what are those behaviors that help you succeed in school? And as you see, the teacher, as part of those home visits, gives the child like a little strategy for how to keep monitor homework and how it's being done, kind of lays it out. This is how you do a task. And although it's just a small sample, and this is very much that, just like we talked about, it's a description of one teacher and the interactions with one family. Of course, this is over a 6-month period. The whole study, I think it was just a few families, but over a year and a half. In this article, they just talk about one teacher and one family. So there's definitely prolonged engagement. There's so much thick description, of the parents and the other kids and, what their interactions are like. So you really get a sense of what this family is like. But there's also disclosure of the positionality of the researcher, like who is, as she talks about, being someone with that background in dominant discourses of English and being from the majority background and how that impacted what she saw. And of course, all the data is collected is based on interviews and observations, again, over a long period of time. And even the coding systems, as they talk about, is kind of depending on the data. So looking at the data, doing a first round of coding, and we'll be talking about what coding is later on in the course. It's very in tune with what the data is. And then finally, the negotiated outcome. So although the original intent of the study was to document what's happening in the family and kind of have the teacher do some of the learning, what ends up happening, but what is more equitable to both teacher and participant, because it ends up helping the child, is that, of course, they get to know more about the family, like they talk about, sharing stories and pictures and, wedding stories and so on. But ultimately, the teacher ends up being of more help because that's kind of what the mom wants from the study. So that emergent and flexible design. But you see that ultimately we privilege the participants, and that maybe that's a good thing to end on, is that in qualitative research, we don't call the people who are part of our studies subjects. We call them participants because it is a form of research that heavily emphasizes social justice and equity and wanting to give voice to populations, and then trying to have research that improves the lives of our participants directly, not just kind of contributing to science overall. So definitely a little bit longer video than I intended. That happens to me, full disclosure. But I hope that you find it useful and a good starting point for understanding qualitative research. And I will talk to you again soon. Thank you.